Good day, Amcanians! This special lesson is dedicated to help you learn the basics of writing different kinds of literature such as poetry and short story. But first, let me introduce who we are. We are the literary group from grade 12 who are tasked to help you start your journey as a writer. This is Maria Bianca Therese Convento speaking, and here is the list of my co-members that you will hear throughout the discussion. But before delving right into the topic, let me first share our group's purpose in this discussion. First is to share our knowledge and techniques in writing based on our personal experiences. Next is to provide an outline of procedure that might work for aspiring writers. As you know, there is no exact procedure on writing a certain kind of literature. There is no formula or standard step-by-step guidelines in writing. So, the techniques or procedure that we will be sharing today are those that actually works for us and most of the writers we know. The third one is to encourage you and canyons in using artistry of literature to express yourselves and help you be more engaged in writing. And last but not the least is to help you develop the skill of analyzing, criticizing, and producing different kinds of writing style or genre.
These are the objectives. The audience will be able to learn the brief history of poetry, short stories, and novels. The audience will be able to identify, understand, and use the different writing techniques of poetry, short stories, and novels. And lastly, the audience should be able to identify the author's message, ideals, and/or purpose. The two things we are going to discuss are poetry and short story and novel.
The first one to be discussed is about poetry. Everyone knows what poetry is, how it is done and presented. Almost everyone had experience writing one. It could be for school or just simply as a hobby. However, not everyone is gifted when it comes to writing. So this part of the video is meant for discussing the tips in writing poetry, specifically by Mabianca Therese Convento and Kenji de los Reyes. After that, a demonstration will be provided as well by Lorraine Alumpa. But before that, let us define first what poetry is. Defined by Britannica, poetry is a literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. Poetry actually predates written texts. The earliest form of poetry is believed to have been recited or sung, employed as a way of remembering oral history. Furthermore, it has been around for almost 4,000 years. Just like other forms of literature, poetry is written to share ideas, express feelings, and produce imagery. A fact about poetry is the Epic of Gilgamesh is considered as the oldest known piece of poetry in the world, and it is a rich literary text that explores themes of honor, glory, and human mortality. Next is Mabianca Therese Convento, and she will discuss her different writing techniques in poetry.
Now I will be talking about my personal techniques in writing poetry. Since there is no standard procedure in doing this, you will be hearing two different techniques from two different people. I will be sharing mine and later on you will hear Kenji talk about his personal style. You may compare and contrast or combine and conceptualize our techniques until you find your very own writing style. Because poetry expresses one's individuality and it reflects onto who you are as a person. Now, let us start by discussing about my actual techniques before writing. First is brainstorming ideas. I first think about the topics that greatly ignites my passion to write. What do I want to write about? What topics am I currently fascinated at? Finding these are crucial for a writer so that we can put our heart into what we write. Ideas and creativity can be found anywhere, believe me. For example, the other day I saw this hole in my bedroom wall and the sunlight peeks through it. Me as a person that loves to write and romanticize about random things, I found this inspiring. So I told myself, I will write about this. And how? Well, that is the question and that is where step 2 will take place. finding motivation. So, with this idea about the damage in my wall, what can I get from it? In a way that, how does it resonate with me? How do I connect with it? Well, so personally, I want to share that I write poems as a hobby whenever I feel some sort of a negative emotion. The strength of that emotion then drives my motivation to write. So, upon looking into that hole, it made me realize that it can be interpreted as something that trespassed into a place it was never supposed to be in, hence, inducing the feeling of being transgressed, which we can already be considered as the motivation of this poem. The next step is to identify the purpose of your poem. What do I want my readers to experience upon reading my poem? Do I want them to be entertained, to be informed, to be persuaded? Do I want to raise awareness, or do I just want to express myself? Next is concretize your role or perspective about the subject or topic you will be talking about. Now, this is important for the audience so that they would know your stand or perspective in the topic you are talking about. Then, our last step before writing is making a list of what we want our poem to include or mention. It might be a phrase or a concept or anything. Now we have this all set, we can now proceed into writing the actual poem. Personally, in writing a poem, I never really liked following a certain rule or technicalities, since I view poetry as a form of self-expression. I often write them in freestyle because how can you express yourself when you are bounded by these technical limitations, right? Now, I am not talking about grammar because that is essential. What I am talking about is the two specific format one might set upon writing, such as a number of syllables per line or how many stanzas your poem should be. Minding these technicalities before your passion and motivation to write take the heart out of your work. So, in free writing, you can start by whatever that comes up into your mind. It can be conversational or maybe a quote or a phrase to catch the attention of your audience. The next step is that don't hesitate to add sense verbs and metaphors. Sense verbs are action words that are describing what you feel in specific and intensive details. A writer usually uses this to make their audience feel the specific feeling they have upon writing the piece. Next is metaphor. It is a figure of speech that is used to make a comparison between two things that aren't alike but do have something in common. These words add flavor or color to your work. It serves as the paint that gives life to your piece. And the third one is to be creative in using symbolisms to represent an element of your poem. Now, this is actually more of a personal preference since I like to express myself in writing, yet I don't want to be direct or rather vulnerable or too vulnerable. I tend to use a lot of symbols to represent emotions or people that will be mentioned in my poem. So in our poem, it is obvious we are not talking to that hole in the wall of my bedroom, right? We are talking about a situation that never should have happened, yet it did. So we can write about that. Now we have a process too after writing. After writing, it is good for you to read your work in the shoes of your reader. If you are the reader, what do you comprehend upon this poem? What does it make you feel? Is your objective as the writer achieved? And lastly, make others read your work and accept criticisms. That is very important because constructive criticisms are essential to grow as a writer. Let us now listen to Kenji, who will be sharing his own personal techniques in writing too.
Hi, these are additional writing techniques you can also utilize before, during, and after writing your piece. So, before writing, the first thing I think about is who is the poem for? Who or what do you aim to empower, inspire, maybe draw emotions out of? Prevent overthinking about the topic. Information overload is a common enemy to writers. Keep a clear mind as to not strain your trail of thought. And last, do not force yourself out of your comfort zone in writing styles. If you want to try different approaches in writing, make sure you've practiced well. Suddenly switching writing styles might hinder the overall product. For example, if you're used to poetry, which has a strict rhyme scheme, it is not wise to suddenly transition into spoken word, which does not abide by your typical rhyme scheme every stanza. Next, during writing. Of course, try not to use words that are too complex or too hard to understand. Limiting them is also an option. Sometimes, keeping in mind of the vocabulary level of the people you wish to present the poetry to just might help you connect with them even more. Next, focus on the content. Sometimes occurrences where a person drifts away too much from the primary thought or topic happens. And last, organize your thoughts while you write, or plan it out beforehand by using a layout. It is important to know the flow of your work for a more organized and cleaner product, but avoid minding the structure too much. And finally, after writing, the first thing you'd want to do after writing is to spread your work in order to get feedback, and don't forget to be open to criticisms. To me, this is one of the most important steps in writing a piece. And last, reread your work as much as you like, even in different perspectives, and see if your objectives to draw something out from your audience has a chance.
I enjoy the subtle sound of leaves rustling against the wind without the familiar fear that usually lurks so nearly. The fear of my piece shattering because of my mother's impending screams. I enjoy the soft cradling my grandfather used to love without the guilt gnawing at my soul that was once known, the guilt that should have been buried alongside his casket of defeat. I enjoy the time being stretched while immersing myself in nothing, simply staring at leaves dancing, forgetting that the sun has set upon me, waiting for another night of complete darkness, not knowing the new patience helps me avoid it. I enjoy laughing so heartily it resonates within the entire house, drowning down the lingering memories of me screaming silent curses, curses that poisoned my reality, reality that life is beautiful for its simplicity. I enjoy this slow, arduous face, this quietness that I face something I never thought I'd experience because of the lie that I made, the lie that I was made for complexity, someone who is incapable of seeing things as it is.
Short stories and novel. First, let's talk about short stories. What is a short story? A short story is a work of prose fiction that can be read in one sitting, usually between 20 minutes to an hour long. There is no maximum length, but an average short story is 1,000 to 7,500 words, but there are some outliers reaching 10,000 or 15,000 words. So, flash fiction and microfiction. A piece of fiction shorter than 1,000 words is considered as a short story or flash fiction. Anything less than 300 words are called microfiction. So, how was short story passed down? Short form storytelling can be tracked to ancient mythologies, legends, folklore, and fables found in communities all over the world. Some of these stories existed in written form, but many were passed down through oral traditions. So it wasn't until the early 19th century that short story collections by individual authors appeared more regularly in print. So novels. So, according to Britannica, a novel is an invented prose narrative of considerable length and a certain complexity that deals imaginatively with human experience, usually through a connective sequence of events involving a group of persons in a specific setting. So, what is a novella? The novel originated in the early 18th centuries after the Italian word novella, which was used for stories in the medieval period. So, when did novels become popular? The novel came into popular awareness towards the end of the 1700s due to a growing middle class with more leisure time to read and money to buy books. So the novels in 19th century. The first half of 19th century was influenced by romanticism of the previous era. Now, the focus was now on nature and imagination rather than intellect and emotion. Gothic is a strain of romantic novel with its emphasis on supernatural events. So, world building. Before even attempting to write a story or a novel, one must learn how to use world building. It is essentially the process of you creating your setting or the place you want your story to begin in or be revolved around in. So there are three types of the world building design to remember. So the three F's of the world design are free design, fixed design, and found design. So let's talk about free design. So to make your own, it is to make your own world at your own pace. Whether you construct a place and erase it afterwards is for your own choice. The only downside of this technique is that your own self-discipline in actually focusing on the main story. So there are four three types of free design. The first one is top down. So you design your world in a larger detail first before going to small ones. So top down is can be presented as an inverted triangle where you first start with the larger details or the general details before dealing to specific ones. So an example of this is you created a world where all lands are covered in water. This is a large detail of your design, and you will likely revolve on this large detail that you have created and descended to smaller details from there. So on the top down, an example for this is the creation of or an author creating or describing the world or the setting of the story before actually proceeding to the main story itself. So next is bottom up. So from in the bottom up, you start from the smallest detail before detailing what is happening in your world. An example is that you start designing your world to have a microscopic creature that can evolve given an amount of time in such specific waters. In this scenario, before the author thinks of a world that is engulfed in water, they first create a creature that is tailored to evolve and live in a biome of water, and then the author ascends to larger details like we have mentioned, a world surrounded only by water. So in bottom up, you first start with so first start with the character or the main character before focusing on or before focusing on what is happening around the character itself. You first so the usual part first beginning of bottom up stories is that or the what you call this so the beginning of bottom up stories are the lives of the main character. So when the character when the character is born, that's usually the start of a bottom up story. It also tackles the how the character grows, its attitude, its the development in personality. Then once the character is or has grown enough, that is when the author starts to incorporate what is happening around the character or the surroundings of the character. So middle out. So you start moderate details you have added in your world design. Like examples we have said, the author begins in creating a creature that is already grown in size, much like a human. So here are some of the questions that are in middle out. Will the reader know the origin of its evolution? No. And the answer is no, but the author will elaborate on that story later on. Does the reader know what world they are witnessing? No, but the author will unravel it later on. So middle out is essentially a plan where you design your world in both ways, creating its smallest detail on the other end, while of course finishing its big detail. So middle out is like you first show either the second half to the ending of the story before showing the beginning up until the point of the story where you first started with. So middle out story is usually or can be seen in movies that first start or first show the conflict of the story, then return back to the beginning. So that is how usually middle out works. So it can be presented as a diamond where you first start with details, then in the middle is the beginning, then going back or proceeding to the details that will lead to the beginning of how you began the story.
So let's discuss about fixed design. We need to take note that fixed design limits the writer. It encloses you because it helps the writer focus on the story. This is the weakness of free design. It is too free to the point that the writer might stave off of creating a story because of all the places he has built. There are two approaches to fixed design. First is the world-based approach. It is to create a world first and immediately focus on the setting you have created. The second one is the story-based approach. This is when the writer actually thought of a plot and builds a world around it. Let's say a knight saving a princess. So from that plot, you design a world around it. Let's say that princess is locked on a castle, or the princess is now kidnapped by a bunch of cultists in a village. That is story-based approach. Now, let's talk about found design. It is merely a design in which the author finds emergent constraints. Emergent constraints are of example is a cave that you initially didn't detail that much of. So in emergent constraints where, for example, a character stumbles upon that cave, and now immediately you thought of is that that character goes into that cave and you detail that cave. For example, it has treasures on it. That is an emergent constraint where you accidentally created a place where your character goes off to. That is emergent constraint. This is applicable to something like Dungeons and Dragons, where the GM or the game master somehow ends up in an area where it isn't that detailed of. So when the character goes off to that area, he details what's in it and what's happening onto it just so the characters progress. Now, let's go on to how to write a good story in steps. Step 1, write a catchy introduction. Step 2, develop the characters of the story. Step 3, identify the point of view to be used in the story. For example, you have a point of view of the villain. How does he interact with the world? And what are his ideologies in the world? Step 4, create meaningful dialogues. Step 5 is set up an interesting plot or conflict and tension to the story. Step 6, create a goal or identify how would you want the story to end. We don't want a bland ending. Step 7, determine what obstacles should you put the main characters to overcome in order to reach the goal or the end. Step 8, build the crisis or climax. And finally, step 9, create a meaningful resolution.
Some words of encouragement from me to you. I want you to keep in mind that writing is a time consuming process. For some of us, it would take a couple of days, maybe weeks, and even years. And during that process, it is completely normal to get stuck with the piece you've been working on. Could be that you lost some of your drive or inspiration, you become confused on what direction you want your writing to go, or sometimes you just get tired. When this happens, the best thing to do is to put it aside and do other activities that would help you recharge in the meantime. And interestingly, one typical reason that we experience this dreaded writer's block is that we want to make our first draft flawless. But I am telling you that you should just start somewhere and work from there. Like what Bianca said earlier, think about how you want your piece to feel like, instead of worrying too much about finding the perfect words. Remember that you can always go back and edit your first draft. If writing is your passion, then it should not feel like a chore to you. I want you to avoid being discouraged because the struggles you experience definitely happen to the best of us. Writing is indeed an art form. Yes, it is a unique personal experience for each one of us. But all writers share one similarity, that we all learn as we go. And I just want to share a quote that has really stuck with me. Good writing is supposed to evoke the sensation in the reader, not the fact that it's raining, but the feeling of being rained upon, by E.L. Doctorow. Thank you for attending this special class and good day to all of us.